So understanding some of the tools and some of the terminology that's used in the charging procedures and the setup procedures for these air conditioning systems is just as important as anything else. And it's also going to fit in with our fundamental baseline of what we're trying to achieve here. So that is our next logical step. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is your basic refrigerant cycle. When it comes to your basic refrigerant cycle, it has a fancy name of a vapor compression refrigeration cycle. I think our industry has uh, a pretty good handle on how to confuse things with terminology. Unfortunately, it's innocent. As you go through and look at this particular picture that's in front of you, the picture is about as simplistic as it gets. You've got on the right hand side in red, you got some curly coils. Those are your condenser coils. On the right, you've got your blue curly coils. That's the evaporator coils. The condenser sits outside and the evaporator sits inside the space. Now, in the middle, up top, you've got a compressor, which compresses the refrigerant. And down below, you've got what's called a metering device. And depending on the scenario, it could have a fixed metering device like a piston, or it could have a variable metering device like an expansion valve. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to start the conversation right here at our service port on the liquid line side. Now don't get confused because there is no actual starting point, there's no stopping point, it's just a vicious cycle that goes round and round and round and round and round. And the reason that I'm starting on the liquid line side is because for me, that's about as easy as it gets for my explanation. So starting at the liquid line service port all the way down to the metering device, which in this example is an expansion valve. That entire section of line set has to be a solid column of liquid. That solid column of liquid is imperative. Everything else is dependent on that. Now think about it. If you were in the backyard and you're holding onto a garden hose and you want to spray somebody by putting your thumb over the end of that garden hose, if you didn't have a solid column of liquid or a solid hose full of liquid, there'd be no way to spray them. And that leads into our next segment, which comes after the line set, which gets to the metering device. What happens there at the metering device? It's magic, right? Well, think about it. We've got a solid column of liquid traveling down that liquid line. Once it gets to the metering device, the whole purpose of that metering device is to change pressures, right? The one thing that we're trying to do here is move heat from inside where we don't want it to the outside where it doesn't matter anymore. And so for us to manipulate heat, we manipulate the pressures. When it comes to refrigerants, if you can manipulate pressures, you're manipulating the temperatures. And so that's the easiest thing for us to do is manipulate those pressures. Pressures and temperatures always go together in the refrigerant cycle. Okay, so if your pressure goes up, your temperature goes up. If your pressure goes down, your temperature goes down. Think about it. If you've ever worked on a refrigeration system, then you would know that the high side or the liquid line side of the system, generally speaking, is warmer than the suction line. Now, why is that? Well, because at the end of the liquid line, before it goes into the evaporator, as we have posted here on this picture, you've got a metering device. The metering device dampens down the refrigerant flow from going through a 3/8 liquid line, for example, which is about the size of your pinky finger, all the way down to an opening just over the size of the head of a pin. So that's like putting your thumb on the end of the garden hose, right? We've restricted the water in the garden hose. We're restricting the refrigerant inside of that liquid line. And as we restrict that refrigerant and we allow some of it to pass by, as it passes by, it begins to expand to try to fill in that much larger space on the back side of that expansion valve. Normally we're going into, say, a header pipe which instead of being 3/8 like it was on the liquid line side, now it's dumping into a header pipe that may be 7/8 or 3/4 even. So in that instance, it's a bigger area, and those molecules try to spread out to fill that area, but we also have a lower pressure area in the backside. Right? We've got lots of pressure on the liquid line side, but not on the vapor side. There's nothing holding that pressure back. So it's a lower pressure, larger area, and just like spraying in the backyard, where those molecules come out of the hose in a stream, but when they squeeze them past your thumb, they spread out in that backyard because it's a much lower pressure, larger environment. They try to fill that space. So it expands them into their droplets, if you will. If you can picture that same scenario happening as the refrigerant goes into the evaporator, the refrigerant goes from liquid form in the liquid line in a solid column of liquid to going through the metering device where it squeezes through a tiny opening, atomizes those refrigerant molecules so it spreads them apart. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, if you run them through a solid column of liquid with no metering device, the only potential for heat absorption is going to be the molecules that are on the outside of that copper actually, or aluminum, actually touching the air as it passes over. And that's a very, very small amount of absorption. So if we can separate those molecules now inside of the evaporator and inside of the copper in that evaporator are able to absorb heat on all sides of the molecule, which is much more efficient, much more rapid. And by the time we get to the end of that evaporator, more particularly the last pass of the evaporator, that's the point at which we really should have all the refrigerant in a boiled off vapor form, and that's also consequently what we call the start of superheat. Okay? And that is imperative for us to be starting the superheat at that point. It does two things. First thing that it does, it makes sure that we're using as much of that evaporator as possible to get the most efficiency possible in the application. And then in addition to that, it also assures that by the time the refrigerant gets to the compressor, it is in a vapor form. We don't want liquid going to the compressor because liquid doesn't compress well. If you don't believe me, we all know, and maybe we are those people that turn the refrigerant tank upside down and charge in liquid form with no throttling valve on there. If you charge in liquid form into the compressor from a tank with no throttling valve, you can hear and you can visibly see on your amp gauge that the amp draw will go up, and you can hear that noise change in the compressor as the liquid's being dumped in there, and it doesn't like what it's chewing on. And some of the more modern compressors will actually go out on overload at that point. So we need to make sure that by the time the refrigerant gets to the compressor, it's 100% vapor form. Okay, so from the evaporator to the compressor, we have got 100% vapor, and as it goes into the compressor, now we take all those molecules that we worked so hard as they went into the evaporator to separate so they could absorb the heat. We're now, as it goes into the compressor, going to work hard at putting those molecules that are now vaporized and have absorbed as much heat as they can. We're putting them into the compressor to compress those together, and as they compress together, what happens? The pressure goes up. Picture an old car engine. In an old car engine, if you've got a piston, as that piston pulls back and that vapor dumps into that piston chamber and the piston slams down on top of it, it takes enough to fill that chamber and squeezes it into a very small area, which shoots that pressure through the roof. And as the pressure goes up, the temperature goes up. Why is that important? Well, because in our next step, we're going out to the condenser. The discharge line coming off of the compressor, going into the actual condenser coils, should be the hottest point on the entire system. And as it dumps into the condenser coils traditionally are going to be sitting outside in the ambient temperature. So we have to make sure that the temperature that we're sending out to those coils is warmer than the actual temperature outside, because heat travels from warmest to coolest. If it's not warmer than the temperature outside, we're not going to transfer any heat from those coils to the outside, or maybe just a little bit of heat. We aid that process by having a fan circulating, drawing the air through those condenser coils to maximize our heat rejection. And by the time we get down to the last third of the evaporator, of the condenser, we should be turning back into a liquid because we're releasing so much heat that there's no longer enough heat to keep it in vapor form, and that refrigerant turns back into a liquid, goes right back into the liquid line, and starts the process over. So let's recap that really quickly. As we go through the process, if we start at the liquid line, from the liquid line to the metering device, it's a solid column of liquid. Once it gets to the metering device pinches it down. Instead of a 3/8 line like it is in the liquid line, it goes through a much smaller opening. So it pinches down the opening and meters the amount of refrigerant actually flowing into the evaporator. And that's important because as it meters it going through the expansion valve in this case, or piston in other cases, it separates those molecules into individual molecules, so that way the droplets of refrigerant can absorb heat on all sides, which maximizes efficiency. And by the time we get to the last pass of the evaporator, we should have absorbed so much heat from the environment that it's sitting in that all of the refrigerant in the last pass of the evaporator and beyond is now boiled into a vapor point. And then it's going on to the compressor. As it gets to the compressor, that vapor goes into the compressor. The compressor compresses it, which shoots the pressure through the roof. As it shoots the pressure through the roof, it sends it into the condenser coils. The condenser coils are going to be hotter than it is outside, which rejects the heat from the condenser coils to the outside air. And consequently, that's exactly the opposite of what happens in the evaporator. And I'm not sure that I pointed that out. So I want to make sure that that is clear as well. In the evaporator, we've got a much lower pressure environment, and because the evaporator is a lower pressure, remember pressures always follow temperatures. If we lower the pressure, then the temperature gets lower as well. So if the temperature is lower in the evaporator than it is in the environment that the evaporator is sitting in, then we're going to get great heat transfer from the environment that it's sitting in to the evaporator. And so in the outside, rejecting that heat in the condenser, exactly the opposite. We always want to have the area that the heat is moving from to be hotter than the area that it's moving to. That's the thermodynamic principle that we're operating off of. We manipulate that again by pressures. Pressures will manipulate temperatures with refrigerants. Pressures go up, temperatures go up. Pressures go down, temperatures go down. It's a really, really simple concept, but until you understand that that's actually what's happening inside of that line set, until you understand that, it's a difficult concept because it all seems like magic. Why do we have cool inside and heat outside? Why is it cool at the evaporator and sweating, but you're telling me inside it's boiling? It's all a manipulation of pressures, and the pressures are translated into temperatures that we would feel. So how could some of this come into play as practical knowledge? Well, think about it this way. 20 years ago, a filter dryer used to have a pressure port on the inlet and on the outlet. Okay, and you would check to see on the inlet and the outlet with your gauges what the pressure difference going in and out was. If the pressure difference was more than 2 psi, then the filter dryer was considered to be an obstruction in the line set and need to be removed and replaced. Now, because the price of materials, I suppose, has gone up so much, there's no more pressure ports on the filter dryers. So then how do you check to see if it's an obstruction? Temperature. You check the temperature going in and the temperature coming out. If the temperature is a certain spread, oftentimes between 6 and 8 degrees difference coming out than what it is going in, now you're able to assume that it's an obstruction in the line set. And how do we know that? Because if it's obstructed, then you're going to have refrigerant flowing up to it being held back, creating more pressure, and when the pressure is created, it sends the temperature up. And as the temperature is sent up, we're able to measure that. So we're able to check whether or not there's an obstruction based on temperature. We've seen people do that oftentimes when you've got an obstruction, maybe a kink in the line set going through a floor or a small piece of wall where maybe the brick has collapsed on it. All of those scenarios, if you understand the principles behind the thermodynamics and the refrigerant flow, you can diagnose. It makes you a better refrigeration or air conditioning technician to understand this stuff. So here we have a PT chart. Now the PT chart is pretty simple, it's pretty archaic. Chances are you're not carrying a piece of paper folded up around in your pocket or your wallet or your clipboard anymore. You're probably using an app, which is, to be honest with you, more comprehensive anyway. So what actually is the PT relationship? Well, if you look at a set of gauges, say an R410A gauge. On the outside of the gauge, you've got your pressures. On the inside of the gauge, you've got your temperatures. And as the dial style gauge is actually moving around and you're able to see the pressure that it's operating at, if you follow that needle down to the middle, it also crosses over a temperature. And that's your pressure and temperature relationship. You would find that that pressure and temperature relationship would hold true on one of these cards if you were double checking it. So why would you ever need to use a PT card or a PT app? Why would you ever need to do that? Oftentimes it's for retrofitting, or more particularly using a set of gauges that weren't designed for the refrigerant that you're working with. Okay, for instance, if I was working with a set of 410A gauges, and I know that the pressure is suitable for 410A gauges to be able to work on R22, and I don't have a set of R22 gauges. Could I physically use the 410A gauges with R22? And yeah, as long as there isn't trapped refrigerant in the hoses and things like that, yeah, of course you could. The dial style gauges are what we're talking about here. So how would you do that? Well, you would not be able to do your normal superheat or subcooling without doing some investigating on figuring out what the temperature pressure relationship is, right? Because on the dial style gauges, with the temperature on the outside and the temperature on the inside and the pressures on the outside, if they're actually 410A gauges, that temperature that's in the middle correlates to the 410A pressure and temperature relationship, right? For every pressure, it correlates to a particular temperature. On different refrigerants, it's going to be different. So we need to figure out what it would be with an R22 setup. So how would you do that with it hooked up and operating? What you would have to do is look at the pressures. Okay, once you get the pressures, say we're operating at 60 psi on the low side. Okay, so we're operating at 60 psi on the low side. I can't look at the temperature in the middle because that would correlate over to R410A. And of course, if you look at the pressure temperature chart here, across the top are your refrigerants. If you go over to 410A right now, which is the fourth refrigerant across the top from the left, not counting the first square, which is temperature, going down that left-hand side. So if you go to 410A and follow it down to 60 psi, which you'll come out at 61.2. If you look to the far left in the temperature column, that correlates to 10 degrees. So you would not be able to go off that temperature chart that's in the middle of those dial style gauges if it corresponds with 410A. So if we've got 60 psi, but we're working with R22 on 410A gauges, we can utilize the pressure on the R22 or the R410A gauge and Say we're working with 60 psi. Now go to the R22 across the top of this PT chart, and the R22 at 60 psi is operating at, if you look just to the left of that, at 35 degrees. Okay, so 35 degrees would be much more reasonable. It's above freezing. It's not grossly above there, but really what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out with a PT chart, the most valuable lesson that you get from the PT chart is how those pressures and temperatures correlate to each other and how much different it is, right? 410A was operating at 10 degrees, for goodness sakes, when it comes to the 60 psi and how that corresponded to temperature. The 60 psi in correspondence with temperature at 35 degrees for R22, that's a huge difference. So that's part of the value of the PT chart. Let's be honest though, if we're not doing retrofits or using a different set of gauges than what our refrigerant is, we're probably not going to use this a whole lot, but it does add value to you as a service technician or as an installer. Even if you're using digital gauges, what happens if the batteries go bad? What happens if you have to take a journeyman test or a master's test and you're asked to figure this stuff out? It's a valuable commodity in the industry, and this is really fundamental to where our industry resides. Those digital gauges are figuring out the superheat and the subcooling for you, but what they're doing is they've got this PT chart pre-programmed in, which is extremely handy, but it also occasionally dumbs us down a little bit. We forget about the math and the process that goes into the backside of learning those things. So very important to understand how the pressure-temperature relationship goes together, and then also how to manually take a pressure and make it correspond to a temperature with a particular refrigerant. So we've talked about superheat and subcooling several times throughout our presentations, through the years, through this presentation. So what do we actually mean by superheat? Well, look at it this way. We know now, some of you are, the science intellect types of guys, and I understand that there's more to this principle than this, right? But just look at it as a baseline fundamental approach to an explanation. We all know that water will boil at roughly 212 degrees. Okay, so it changes states at 212 degrees. We've got water, we've got steam. And on the other side, say at 215 degrees, we have steam. So between 212 and 215, the point at which it changed to steam and the temperature that it currently resides at would be superheat. We added heat to it beyond that change of state, right? So you would have 3 degrees of superheat. Now on the opposite side of that, it'll turn back into water if it starts to cool down at 212 degrees, and it could very easily be 209 degrees, or it could be 70 degrees, like the water that's sitting on my desk. That is subcooled, right? It's cooled beyond the point that it took to change states from the steam back to the water. And that's really what we're talking about here. Superheat is adding heat beyond the change of states. And that's what we're measuring with a fixed metering device. A fixed metering device is just literally a hole in the line set, in the liquid line set, like my thumb. If I'm spraying water in the background on somebody and I couldn't move my thumb, or better yet, I've got one of those adjustable nozzles that I screw it open, I screw it closed, it doesn't move. Once you get it there, it doesn't move. So the only way that I could spray somebody is if they're within range of that, or if I increase or decrease the pressure. So a fixed metering device example would be a piston, an actuator, an orifice, a metering loop. I know one of the brands used to have a 50-foot metering loop in line with that, which works fine. Could be cap tubes that we're talking about here. So superheat is a term that we use when we're checking the charge on a fixed metering device, right? So superheat is used for checking charge on a fixed metering device. Subcooling, on the other hand, a little bit different. Subcooling is a way to check a charge on a system that has an expansion valve. And we could have an automatic expansion valve, a mechanical expansion valve, an electronic expansion valve. We're talking expansion valves in general, right? An expansion valve has the ability to now, if I was in the backyard and you're bobbing and weaving trying to stay away from me spraying you with the garden hose, I can now move my thumb in and out to spray farther or closer based on my pinch point. Expansion valve does the same thing. The whole purpose of an expansion valve is to get the same amount of superheat, whatever it's set to, all the time, regardless of what's going on in the environment around it. Oftentimes, if you've got varying loads, for instance, somebody walking in and out of a walk-in cooler all the time, or potentially you live maybe in the Midwest, where you have temperature extremes, where it may be 100 degrees outside, and inside you're wanting it to be 70 degrees, but then that 100-degree day could quickly turn into a 50 or 60-degree day with a storm. Varying loads like that are easily compensated for with an expansion valve, because it can open or close to allow more refrigerant into that evaporator coil, or restrict refrigerant from going into the evaporator coil to maintain that superheat that it's designed for, which gives it nice even temperature and oftentimes increases the efficiency of the overall system because of it compensating like that. So expansion valves, one of the things that they do in order to adjust the amount of refrigerant that's going into the coil is, of course, check the temperature on the line set coming out of the coil on the vapor side of the system. And that's called a thermostatic expansion bulb. And that bulb has a small amount of gas that's similar to the gas that it's actually measuring. So if you've got R22 in the system, you're going to have an R22 expansion valve, which tells you roughly that you're going to have something similar to R22 in the expansion bulb, and you're going to have a suitable orifice size in the expansion valve for R22. Now, R410A would be a little bit different, but you're not allowed to use the different metering devices for the different types of refrigerant oftentimes, because volume is different and the pressure temperature relationship is different. So the idea behind that expansion valve, it checks the temperature coming out of the coil, it checks the pressure coming out of the coil, oftentimes with an external equalization tube, but then it also has what's called the external equalization tube in the off cycle allows refrigerant to bypass the expansion valve to go from the high side to the low side of the system in order to equalize, so that the next time that the system starts up, it won't be under a load. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind with an expansion valve is, in nearly all applications, if you have an expansion valve, you really should have a start assist capacitor on there, or a start assist device. And the reason being is because if you do have cycles that turn off and on relatively close in time to each other, the expansion valve does have a very slow equalization time. So you could be trying to start back up where you're under a bind with high pressure on one side and low pressure on the other side, which could cause a hard starting condition, lights dim, breaker tripping under a bad scenario, those types of things. So remember, just in recap, the difference between an expansion valve and a piston, the type of charging procedure that you will use to charge the system. Subcooling is always used on an expansion valve. It's done on the liquid side of the system, or the high side of the system. Subcooling is a factor of the difference between the high side temperature on the gauge and the high side temperature on the liquid line itself. You subtract the big number and the small number. Don't worry about which one's supposed to be hotter or colder. At this point in the game, that is not a concern. You're not creating the refrigeration system. You just need to know how it operates. And subtracting the low from the high is fairly simple to remember. You don't have to remember which one's supposed to be lower and higher because it can't be reversed. Okay, so subcooling is always done on the liquid line side of the system. Superheat is always done on the vapor side of the system, and the superheat, just like the subcooling, is a factor of the difference between the vapor side of the system on the vapor gauge. You've got a temperature on the vapor gauge, a temperature on the actual vapor line itself. The difference between those two is your active superheat. Okay, once you check those things, and I don't need a card or any of those things to check that. I don't need to have backup notes. I can subtract the temperature on the gauge, the temperature on the line set. Right? What are we talking here? Somewhere between 6 and 20. I can subtract that much. You can subtract that much. So don't be tied to some kind of card or chart on that. First thing I need to figure out, what's my charge right now? What's it looking like? What's my superheat or my subcooling? Superheat's always done with a fixed metering device. Subcooling's always done on an expansion valve. Okay, so what does my charge look like, and do I need to adjust it? Once you figure out what your subtraction is, okay, now you have to decide to yourself, is that good enough? Well, I can't tell you that. The manufacturer will tell you that. A slide chart on the superheat side will tell you that, but that's a decision you've got to make. Now, one of the other differences between superheat and subcooling is how they react, your measurement that is, with adding or removing refrigerant. If your superheat is off and you add refrigerant to the system, adding refrigerant reduces the overall superheat. On the subcooling side, if you have an expansion valve, adding refrigerant increases the subcooling. Okay, so if you're adding refrigerant, it works exactly the opposite on superheat as it does on subcooling. Okay, so remember those factors. Very, very important. Some of the tools that you'll use to check your charge, fairly simple. We've got a digital psychrometer here, used for several things. You can take your wet bulb and dry bulb inside of the home, which is very, very useful and necessary for checking your charge. And here I've got a small throttling valve. Okay, this one's actually named InstaCharge, and it's just a throttling valve is all it is. It's a little aluminum attachment that goes on your manifold just below the vapor gauge, and it allows you to pull the modern style refrigerants, which are almost all blended. For instance, 407C. It allows you to pull the refrigerant out of the tank in liquid form, and then before it goes into the actual compressor area, this InstaCharge has a orifice in there, and it will flash the refrigerant back to a vapor, so it protects the compressor as you're doing your charging procedures. You have to have some kind of a reliable thermometer that you're able to use, and different thermometers work good in different areas. For checking airflow, I love this kind of thermometer because it's angled down. You stick it up in the ductwork above your head, and you're able to look up at it, and it's angled down at you so you can read it relatively easily. But I don't like those in the line set. The line set ones, I like the straight ones, so they're pointed right back up at me again. Different thermometers work great in different areas, like I said. You got to have a standard set of gauges, something that you use as your staple every day. And it's got to fit the type of work you do. If you're working on refrigeration systems, you're probably going to want a digital set of gauges nowadays. The digital set of gauges are going to have tens, 20s, hundreds sometimes of different refrigerants programmed into them. So you'll be able to use the one set of gauges for everything virtually. Whereas if you're not working on a wide array of different gauges or different refrigerants, such as in a manufacturing facility or something like that, well, maybe a regular set of dial style gauges is for you. Okay? Know what you're working on and get your tools according to your workload and the type of stuff that you're going to be doing. That's the best I can tell you. Make sure that you have a scale. One of the main requirements of the EPA guidelines for refrigerant charging licenses is making sure that you're maintaining an accurate refrigerant record. You know, you're weighing the refrigerant in, you're weighing the refrigerant out. How much did I add to this system? Who lived there? What's the model and serial number? How much was used? The type of refrigerant? The address that I put it in? All of those things are important, and you can't do any of them if you don't have a scale. And then, of course, pay attention to the refrigerant that you're using. If you notice on this refrigerant bottle, we've got arrows, and here they're pointing towards the bottom end. What that's telling me, if you could zoom in and get close to that, it's telling me that you charge with this end up. So in reality, if I wanted to use this tank right here to charge a system, I'd have to turn it upside down, and the purpose is to pull out in liquid form. Most of the HFCs are blends, not all of them, but most of them. Certainly the 400 series family are blends. So the only way that a blend is able to be charged in its blended compound is in liquid form. If you pull out in vapor, then you may charge the product unevenly because they have different molecular weights. So inside of that tank, you've got different layers of refrigerant at different points.